Thanks everybody, and thanks for having me. So if I had to talk about Althea, I'd need more than 20 minutes. So I'm going to try and be really concise. And thanks for having me. Yeah. So I've chosen this quote, "Black because it has power in it," because this is a quote from Althea's voice. So if Althea was here, she'd be talking about why use this term, black because it has power in it. And she uses black in a lot of her designs, a lot of her textiles as the primary color. And I've chosen this quote because it's kind of a double-ended quote. It's talking about the color black and how we use it as a color to highlight particular aspects of work, but also because as a Black woman, she created inroads in a space when technically she shouldn't have occupied that space. And using a colloquial Caribbean term, we take up space, if you like. This notion that we're now coming to points in gallery spaces, in museum spaces, in craft spaces, where you're no longer seeing exhibitions for 1, 2, 3, 4 days or 4 or 5 weeks. You're now seeing where exhibitions about critical designers and artists now are lasting 3 months, 6 months. This gives agency to the work that they did. And if we think that 40 years ago, Althea as a artist, as a designer, was presenting to iJADE, and it was highlighted as a really important part of the conference. She's now back at the conference in spirit 40 years later. We have to ask, what has been the impact of Black designers and Black artists within the iJADE space as a journal, but also to the NSEAD cohort as a whole. So if you've not seen Althea, this is Althea. And she talks a lot about color, shape, and pattern are her medium of expression to produce a spontaneous reaction. So when you look at her work, what is it that you see? What reaction do you have? What is your emotional response to her work? And throughout the 6 months of the show at the William Morris in Walthamstow, and also it's not been on a month yet at the Whitworth, we've had responses from when people walk into the room, visitors walk into the spaces, to be bathed in sunshine, to people smile, visitors stand still, people talk to each other, people stand and look up or look around or gaze or walk up to or stand back. So there is a physical response, there is a visceral response, there is an emotional response. And is this what art is supposed to do to you? Is this what textiles is supposed to do to you? When we consider that textiles is taken as this sometimes a lower form of art within the art world space, as a definition of what is art supposed to do to you. But if we kind of think about how Althea then uses this notion of art and flowers and textiles. So even in this is an image from the William Morris Gallery, and this is in the cafe, and the fabrics that we see suspended from the ceiling were fabrics that were reissued as part of the Liberty range of fabrics. So Liberty reissued 12 of Althea's iconic fabrics. But the quote we see here, "the flowers of the English countryside transformed into a Caribbean flamboyance," were actually kind of taken from a quote by her husband, John Weiss, who was also a designer himself, who talks about the fact that Althea would take flowers and items from the English countryside, so small thistles, small pansies, small flowers, and actually explode them out. And in that explosion of transforming these tiny flowers, she would actually use colors like black to kind of emphasize the beauty of the flower, but using this strong color like black as the thing to actually to actually show that these tiny flowers had so much power and positioning in them. But also taking this notion of that there is a Caribbean flamboyance, when the Caribbean is a construct. It's not a place. It's a constructed place. So this notion that Althea was also constructing a place or a scene or a broader understanding, if you like, of difference, of boundaries, if you like. When she herself was being described in many different forms. I've seen her described as a dusky maiden. I've seen her described as a West Indian, as a Jamaican. So if you come from Jamaica and you're described as a Trinidadian, then you would say, well, no, I'm not. I am Jamaican. I'm not Trinidadian. They're different countries. They are different parts of the Caribbean diaspora. But there's notion that sometimes it is you are described by the color of your skin rather than by where you come from. I think Althea took that and transitioned all of that context into her textiles. But what I want us to think about is, how does the history of cloth further the organization of social and political life, or help social groups reproduce themselves, or produce or achieve an autonomy or interaction with others? And I think Althea used her cloth in that way. The colors that she used on the cloth, how she took cloth. And whilst people say she might not have been politically active, I believe Althea used politics within her cloth, in the way that she named her cloth, in the way that she designed her textiles, in the way that she positioned them to actually make people talk about how cloth itself can make you feel. Her cloth, when it's hung, has this way of transforming a space to almost feel like you're in a cathedral type space. It has a way of making you interact. It has a way of making you think about how the cloth makes the space change. And she did this not only with her cloth, but also with the wallpapers that she created. And she would do this also through education. So for those of you that don't know, Althea taught at places like Hornsey School of Art, like Walthamstow School of Art. She would go on to teach at London College of Communication. So she actually went back into education. She worked with not only with the Design Council, she was very much a person of, how do I give back into education, of what education has given back to me. And like we said, I revisited the context, or the journal where they wrote about the 1984 conference. And what came through in that journal was the notion that she had this passion for art and design education, which she took throughout her career. And the notion that Althea's presentation was a high spot of the conference, that her work was fresh and brilliant, and it brought a flood of colour into our monochrome environment and provided a welcome relief from words. So this notion that Althea herself says that whenever she did a presentation, she always presented her work. She relied on the fact that the visual was the way in which to actually ask or get a response from people. And this notion that it wasn't that she dwelt on presenting lots of people with text, it was that she presented her colour, her work, her passion for art, her passion for the fact that it was colour that could make a difference. When you look at her work, and this is the work in the William Morris Gallery, what you can see is the colour that stands out, and the way in which her work was designed for the new kind of postmodern structure of building work. So if we look back and see that design at the time, new buildings were being built, we were living in a postmodern era. Her designs met those postmodern constructs. They had to be dramatic, they had to fill space, they had to meet new modern windows, new modern designs, and her designs met those constructs. But she was also, she considered that her work, she looked at expressionism, she spent 2 years in Paris, she went around she loved museums, and so she was also informed by modern artists, by modern designers. She said that she was impressed by Van Gogh, and you can see that iterated in this work, for instance, called Van Gogh, where she actually inspired by the use of sunflowers, but you can see the notion where she just emphasized the use of the line, the black line, with these dramatic giant sunflowers drawn in a monochrome way. And what she did she used a lot of monoprinting. So monoprinting, where she just emphasized using black monoprints, and then she would build her color on top. So she usually would start with a black monoprint for a lot of her work, and then she would actually then build the color into it later on. So this notion that black became that dominant theme for a lot of her abstracted work. Like I said, the show, the show's already on at the William Morris Gallery, and now it's on at the Whitworth. So for those of you that live up north, you have the opportunity to now go and see it, and it's a different show up north, 100 new pieces of work. But what I would ask you is, if 40 years ago she was doing the work that she did, and she was so influential at the conference 40 years ago, what is her influence now on you as a community? Where do you see her influence being? Where do you see it going? How do you see it 40 years on? If we had to look for that seminal book on her, you won't find the seminal book, because 40 years on, I'm sorry to say, there isn't a seminal book. So whilst we have the retrospective, we still don't have that seminal text or canon that actually says, this is what Althea did, this is her work, this is her legacy. So how do we say that this woman left this legacy? How do we inform our students, ourselves, about what her legacy is? If she was so influential, do we have to answer why we do not yet have that content that we can then give to students and say, look, this was this influential Black woman, the first to go to the RCA and do this seminal work in textiles, the first to actually be of international standing. If she was of international standing, why haven't we then encompassed her within our whole curriculum? Why am I still being asked by students today, I've never heard of her? If she was so influential, why have I never heard of her? And I would say she's still a chapter, a footnote, and an abstract. Yet in 1963, she featured in Vogue as the fresh face of design, with a brilliant sense of colour, designing for heels and liberties. I would say she designed for people like Guy Laroche. Her work was featured in these amazing florals, and you can see this hint of black just in this floral design. She uses it to very subtly to actually emphasize the floral shapes that she's exploded in these compositional fabrics. And what she talks about with flowers and is that in the end of the 1950s, she said women were dressed in flower pots and she wanted to dress them in flowers. So she takes the floral and she transforms it into this notion of moving it from being this static product into this thing that actually clothes the body rather than sits on the body. And we start to see this here where she takes understands the technology of design. So it's taking her understanding of her technological acuity, combining with her creativity to give her freedom to design as she pleases. And the notion where she keeps saying black because it has power in it is not only because it has power in it, but it gives her the freedom to design, and to develop a complete freedom is to actually say, it doesn't matter how I start my design, but I know I can use whatever color I feel actually allows me to do the design in the way that I want to do it. So this notion of freedom in designing, I think, is something that we can actually allow ourselves to have. But that comes with technological freedom. So she said she wanted to be the best designer she could be through technological freedom. And that technological freedom meant knowing everything she could know about the process of screen printing. And we see this when we look at this design called Bazik by Liberties. And it was the only design, she said, to contain grey. So black was the colour of power, red because she just loved red. She thought it was one of the most important colours to have in her palette. And every single design she ever created had red in it. And grey is a non-colour. It's neither black nor white, and it's a non-colour. But she was persuaded, Liberty said she had to have grey in her design. And this is a non-textured stripe, and the printers loved, the technicians in her notes, in her archival notes, said the printers loved it because it didn't matter if it went wrong, because it was not a straight stripe. It was a non-textured stripe. But again, when we looked in her archive, this design also had black in it, and the black just is very, very subtle, and but it is there. And she felt that this notion of how she envisaged her designs was very much about how she also thought about the freedom to design technically and push technological limits. I think this is one of her most interesting designs. It's a design for a company called Dinasco. And in this, we see how she uses black as a form of expression, but also as a form of abstraction. And it's only when you go up close you realize that she's taken the notion of a flower stamen and abstracted it so it doesn't look like a flower stamen anymore. And it's this notion of her experimental approach to media and the medium of screen printing. And I think through this process, or through her process of printing onto textiles, I think people will look back at screen printing again with a whole different approach to screen printing and repeating and layering. And one of the things that we've found by looking at Althea's work, some of her designs contained up to 20 colours. So can you imagine doing screen printing with 20 layers of colours to get the effect that you want? And could we do that? Would we do that today? Would we actually explore that depth of colour or depth of understanding of how we can apply colour to this extent? Or would we just say 6 colours is enough? We know that in commercial printing, if you go more than 6 colours, they're telling you your design is too expensive. If you want to go more than 6 colours, we are pushed to using digital printing or digital technologies to push our limits. But going back to that hand notion of the screen and looking at how you can create those subtle layers of colours and then just finishing off with this dramatic black. But taking that notion of drawing on painters for you, that notion of looking at nature. So Althea used nature as her calling card. So going back to nature for her was the key thing, looking at flowers under the microscope. She had an amazing garden and she used Q, she used she's got sketchbooks going back to 1949 that we were able to draw on to look at how she actually looked at the world, and she never went anywhere without a sketchbook. So we were able to actually explore how she herself thought about pattern and design, and this notion of everything she did, she looked at how black had power in it. And we see this in the work Trinidad, how although this looks really purple and blue, it's actually also multi-layered with black, which you can't actually see in this slide very well. But if you get the chance to have a look at this particular design, have a look at it. It's layered with depths of purple, blues, and I couldn't get the photograph to come out any cleaner. But it's layered with blues, deep purples, deep navies, and then black. And when you go up close to it, it shows how she knew how to play with color and how to play with depth and how to play with what I call pushing boundaries. So even in her work, she wanted to think about how you could push boundaries or blur boundaries and show difference. And I think that came a lot from who she thought she was, this notion of how she needed to show that she was a different designer and how she could push the boundaries of color. And that was what made her different. She wasn't afraid of color. She said, what is there to be afraid of when you use color? And we see this in these two designs. There's Painted Desert on the right for Hull Traders, and she used the giant cacti called the Old Man. This has been influenced on her trips to Mexico and the States. And then on the image below, which I'm wearing as well, Acrana, based on poppies, which she loved, and large tulips and thistles. It's this notion of how you rescale. And again, it's dominated by this black. But this notion of, for her, it's also the notion of scale. So Painted Desert is also a large print in the V&A, and the large print is probably an A1 image. What Althea has done, she's rescaled it. So she learned to rescale to even make the black still a dominant feature of her imagery. And what she then goes on to do in her textiles even further is take this through into exploring new challenges. So how many of you remember Terylene out in the audience? I can't see the chat, but how many of you remember Terylene, the quick dry fabric that was brought out in the 60s to make the housewives' lives easier? Well, Althea was actually brought in as the key woman to actually transform plain white Terylene into this marvelous fabric that could attract color. And she took that same influences that she'd looked at earlier and actually explored how you could use it, put black into it and put all these colors, all the things she learned about color, she was putting into this notion of this new fabric Terylene. What was important in this, though, however, she also worked with the fashion designers and also what they call the makers up or the manufacturers. And in this team, in this kind of circle of working, she started to transform the process of manufacturing. Thank you. Started to transform the process of manufacturing. And the manufacturing systems that we have now in this country started to change in 1966 when Althea was working as a designer. So her influence of designing and working with and communicating with fashion designers about how a print could work in design started in 1966. So they could reduce wastage in fabrics. But she also designed wallpapers. So she was changing the way in which we could look at wallpapers and seducing architects to move, who liked white walls, to move from white walls. But funnily enough, they thought she was a old Scottish lady. They didn't realize that she wasn't a little white Scottish lady. And if you want to read more about her, you can, this book, Building Britannia, is really good chapter. And we can see now, here are some of her earliest wallpapers called Crystalline, 1960. But one of the things that Althea did to create her wallpapers, she would always do them, start off with a kind of a monoprint approach, and then she would use coloured acetate in bright acid colors to actually look at how she could do color change. And the picture above is her being showcased in one of the Design Council archives for the Wallpaper Manufacturers Group, looking at her wallpaper in 1960. And and you can see another one of her wallpapers, Tayasia, and then on the right is another one of her wallpapers, Zircon, in 1968. So over a period of about 10 years, we know that she did a whole range of wallpapers, and they all have black kind of in them to kind of emphasize kind of structure or texture, or different kind of ways of working, or to emphasize line. But she had this amazing kind of signature that she carried through. And she did the same thing with her mural work, which kind of moved her into a different material area. So we can see her moving her materiality of textures and stuff across different papers. And I've probably only got 2 minutes left. And I would say she combined that work with thinking about her ancestry and her inspiration. Like I said, she used nature and man's arts and artifacts. And she continues to just look at that through even drawing on her own heritage. So like I said, she always went back to her own heritage. And we can see this from her paintings from 1953, 1954 and 1955. And just being inspired by nature. And just to say it's just black because it has power in it. And I'm just going to finish off now. I would leave you with Golden Harvest, because Golden Harvest is probably one of her most famous designs. And this one is where you do see the black being the most prominent. It looks like the wheat sheaves are blowing in the wind. And this is because the last screen, the wheat sheaves are actually drawn onto the screen. So all the rest of the background print is printed traditionally, but the wheat sheaves actually drawn physically onto the screen and then printed. So she was actually thinking about how she could make the last of the image animated and almost alive. But it's also embedded with this notion of slavery and colonialism, as she talks about her imagery being influenced by the sugarcane fields back at home in Trinidad. She continues to think about how her designs are a form of her expression. And I'm just going to finish off that we showcase her work alongside as an artist and activist with the Caribbean artist movement and the makers such as Paul Dash, Errol Lloyd, Vanley Burke. So if you do get to go to Whitworth, you will see her contextualized in a much better way. And just finishing off with some of her artworks, some of her drawings, so you can see the strength of how she uses black in her artwork and her textiles. And I would say if we wanted to reflect on where she is, what does reflection mean? It means to look back, familiarize. What have we learned? How do we revalidate? How are we going to add structure to the learning or identify how good something is that we've learned? But if we're doing a retrospective, it's a compilation of the artist's work to look back on or relate to or thinking.